relate to the open space acquisition 1920. That's item 16. And I will move it if Councillor Casey would second it for discussion.
Yep.
So you've got Paul, Marriott Lloyd, supported obviously from Kataraina. So Paul, all yours.
Kia ora koutou, Paul Murray Lloyd, Takawingoa. I'm very pleased to present our annual report in terms of the open space that was acquired in the last financial year. It is a great news story. There were 8 new parks and open spaces that were acquired, and they equate to 103 hectares. Of those, the most significant acquisition was the addition to the Maharangi East Regional Park. That was 95 hectares, and did want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of Mace Ward in terms of making that possible. We also acquired land which will allow us to form a new sports park in Whenuapai, and then there were 6 neighbourhood parks. Despite all of this new land, we somewhat have to counteract a misperception that our open space isn't expanding and that we're not responding to growth. So part of the recommendation is that we have a series of communication initiatives to promote these new parks, and one of which, Maya, if you can click on that link, what we're proposing is an animation that draws Aucklanders' attention to those new parks and open space.
Yeah, just give us a few seconds, Paul.
Ka pai.
Paul, is there anything that you might be able to add as we have a look at playing the video?
Oh, here we go.
Okay. Oh, hold up. Yeah, just excuse the technical issues as you can all see. Richard, is
I think there was a question. Normally there is a, sorry, Mr. Chairman. So normally there's a soundtrack, there's a voiceover that goes with it. It follows the text that was running along the bottom of the screen. What we can do, Mr. Chairman, is we'll load this up so that councillors will have the opportunity to play it.
Yeah, that might be the better if we'll just have one more crack at it, Paul. It is on Nexus, and my understanding is that it can be played if the committee wanted to go on Nexus.
And it can also be downloaded, and so elected officials can use it if they so choose in terms of social platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook and the like.
Okay, look, just apologies to everybody. There's the link on Nexus, and then as Paul just suggested, it can be downloaded as well. So look, Paul, if we could continue, that would be great. Thank you.
Indeed. So we also report this time the non-service land that was disposed of in the last financial year. So there were 4 pieces of vacant land that were disposed of. They equate to less than a third of a hectare, but they brought in $3.4 million. So in terms of making a comparison between the land that we acquired and the land that was disposed, the total area of disposed was again 0.36% of that 103 hectares. That's really a summary of the report. Happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. I'll go to Councillor Walker.
Hi, Paul.
Kia ora.
I've got a couple of questions, and it's really good to note that we've got these new parks. The particular concern that I've got is less the dollar value of the park and the area of the park by itself, but more the relationship of the additional area that we're getting to the increased population size of Auckland, and the relationship of the area to the subdivision area, given that the park may be coming to us from development contributions. And I consider that to be incredibly useful information from the perspective of monitoring and management. And the reason that I raise that is that, as councillors know, historically, the council received reserves through the provisions of the Reserve Act. And those provisions generated significantly more reserves than what we receive now. In fact, I doubt whether we'd be hitting 2% of the area of a subdivision compared to the 6-7% that we were getting through the Reserves Act. So the consequence is, over time, that the amount of reserve space per area of population, especially as it goes to intensification, is progressively reducing. Is it possible for us to have information on that on an ongoing basis for the purposes of benchmarking, monitoring and management? That's my question.
Through the chair, so there some of the legacy councils used to operate on the basis of what was called reserve contributions. So in lieu of paying development contributions, a developer would set aside land for open space purposes. Since amalgamation, Auckland Council has used what's called development contributions, and so those are contributions that are taken for each household equivalent unit that are developed, although there are some exceptions to that, as we heard in the item earlier on in the agenda. So we don't actually, and we've also moved away from, in terms of open space by population, to what's generally considered to be good practice, which is about providing open spaces that are proximate to the population. So of all of the that were acquired financial year, those are all in new development areas, and they will help meet the open space and sport and recreation needs of those new communities. But we don't collect those metrics that would allow us to make those comparisons between the development contribution regime and the reserves contributions as was suggested.
Can I just ask a supplementary question? So the change to proximity is new to me. In the earlier policy, I think we had 20 square metres per person. So have we now disregarded that in terms of a policy framework that informs us?
So in 2016, Auckland Council adopted the Open Space Provision Policy, and that provision policy sets out how we respond to growth and deliver parks that are proximate to the population. So that's a much better way of dealing with higher levels of density. So where it's more dense, we deliver parks that are closer to the populace. So for example, in high and medium density areas, a neighbourhood park would be within 400 metres of people's houses, and that goes out to 600 metres in low density areas.
I understand the proximity. My particular concern is around any metric that goes to the ratio of density, because you could have areas that are very, very dense with very, very large numbers of people, with on the basis of proximate policy, still woefully inadequate reserve space. So I have an ongoing concern, Mr. Chair, that Auckland is trading off the legacy of park space that we've inherited. And going forward, Auckland will be much, much poorer for it. I know that from my perspective, this is an issue that the officers are reluctant to deal with because it challenges our present development contributions regime. But I just want to put it on the table yet again, Mr. Chair. I'm bringing it to the attention of other councillors. It does concern me. Thank you.
No problems at all. It's been put on the table, so at least we can acknowledge that. But the DCs are obviously an issue that needs to be sort of sorted out at some stage. So, Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to echo Paul's words about Mace Ward. I think Mace has been in understanding, you know, there's two areas here, but one in particular is the issue of regional parks, and we'll deal with that as the next agenda item. But with the acquisition of outstanding coastal land, it is increasingly getting out of the reach of council unless we can actually draw on the support of the community and generous bequests and philanthropy generally. And I think that we do need to acknowledge that Mace has been to the forefront of establishing some of the partnerships that will enable us to do these critical pieces of coastal land and acquisitions as evidence in the most recent extension to regional parks. But I'd like Paul to comment on that. Obviously, those contributions that you referred to, and it's good to actually make that distinction and remind councillors on how we are funding some of these open space little bits in the jigsaw puzzle, but where do you see the opportunity, given the enormous increase in value to coastal land that we've seen in Auckland over the last 40 years? How do you see us making further acquisitions in terms of expanding on the existing regional parks network, Paul?
And thank you through the chair. With respect to the Maharangi, yes, it's really important to acknowledge the bequest that came from both the John Turnbull and the Margaret Turnbull Philanthropic Trusts, and there's a recommendation that the committee thanks those trusts for the bequest because they contributed $5.28 million towards the total acquisition cost of 11.75, so just under 50%. Which enable council to acquire that land in Maharangi for Aucklanders for the future. And in making that acquisition, that involved committing the non-growth related funding for open space acquisition for several years. So what we did in terms of, in order to acquire that land, was to set aside 3 years of funding, which enabled council to acquire that. So that model was maybe something that we need to look at as we look at other acquisitions in non-growth related areas. With respect to coastal property, we certainly know that one of Auckland's defining features is its harbours, and we know that Aucklanders love to recreate in and around coastal environments. So we're very conscious in terms of how we can provide continued access to open space. There are opportunities, obviously, through the development processes where we acquire esplanade upon subdivision. But what we certainly do is prioritise any acquisitions that will provide further access to Aucklanders to the coast. And as part of that, we also have to do think a little bit further forward in terms of what the climate impacts might be in some of those coastal areas. So part of that is looking at our strategies in terms of, rather than acquiring land that runs along the coast, we may need to buy pieces of or parcels of land that also run inland, which would allow us over time, in case there was any sort of coastal inundation or erosion type issues, so that we would have an open space that would be a lasting legacy well into the future. So these are things that we are looking at, and certainly looking around for opportunities to expand open space in non-growth areas as well as growth areas.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer, and I'm really pleased that you've raised the matter of the type of acquisitions that we need, and not just the Esplanade reserves, but the inland properties that will enable us to be able to respond accordingly. Can you tell me where on the work program we can expect to see a report coming back to this committee, on the issue of the types of partnerships and philanthropy that will enable us to make those sorts of coastal acquisitions? Will we be seeing a paper on that? Is that forecast in the next year or so? Or perhaps that's a question I can better put to the chair. But I think it's a really interesting piece of work that we need to engage ourselves in, because it's not just going to be ratepayers that can help us make those acquisitions, and I think we do need to be a lot more creative looking into the future.
Kia ora, Councillor Fletcher. It's Katarana Maki here. I'm just wanting to respond to that, and sorry, my video is coming on very slowly. We are happy to bring back a report to this committee on those matters, but in addition, we can work up some information for your future long-term plan considerations, because it is also a discussion, not just about future philanthropy, which of course MACE does very, very well, but also about non-growth funding that isn't funded by our development contributions. So we would be happy to bring back a paper and then look at working up small business case for consideration during long-term plan considerations by elected members.
Nice to hear from you. Thank you for that response, because I think what's going to happen, Mr. Chair, if we get this video out there and we start generating discussion and understanding of what the council is doing in the open space acquisition area, it will generate greater interest. So it would be nice to think that we have a body of work that is going to be one that we can refer to, that we are following through on these sorts of commitments.
Perhaps as a suggestion, Councillor Fletcher, we could meet with you as the portfolio lead with MACE and the chair of this committee and just map out what you all would like us to bring back.
I would welcome that. I'm in the chair's hands on that matter.
Yeah, no, Katarana, to that suggestion, no problems at all with that. No issue. Also, I've just added an E, Councillor Fletcher, as you as the mover and myself as seconder, to be included, and that is really to acknowledge the staff efforts in the acquisition of new parks and open space, instead of specifically naming one or two of the staff.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I don't know if there's any further questions or comments of either Paul or Katarina. I haven't seen them. So if there are none, it's been moved and seconded. I will put the recommendation. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against? Carried. Paul, Whawhtailawa and Katarina Ngamihi. Thank you. We then move on to Kia ora. I think, yep, we'll move on to